In the year 1965, while filming a forgettable movie on a soundstage in Hollywood, Elvis Presley secretly spent over $5,000 on more than 200 books about God. It was the first step in a plot to kill the king of rock and roll. But how does a man who has everything the world can offer, the money, the fame, the women, become so desperate for something else that he is willing to trade his crown for a monk's robe and a vow of silence? The California sun was a lie. It was a relentless, indifferent glare cooked up by studio lights inside a cavernous, dusty building that smelled of stale coffee and desperation. Out there, beyond the gates of Paramount Pictures, the world was exploding in a kaleidoscope of color, sound, and revolution. The Beatles were redefining music. Dylan was giving a voice to the voiceless. But in here, inside the golden cage, time stood still. For Elvis Presley, it was a prison, where the walls were made of money, and the bars were the celluloid strips of his own movies. Another day, another script. Harem Scarum, Paradise, Hawaiian Style. The titles blurred into one long, meaningless sentence. He was a product, a beautiful, singing commodity, whose job was to hit his marks, kiss the girl, and sell another soundtrack album. The fire that had once burned so brightly it scorched the entire landscape of popular culture had been reduced to a pilot light, flickering weakly against the crushing weight of contractual obligation. He was a king in exile from his own kingdom. The nights were the worst. Back in the sterile opulence of his Perugia Way mansion in Bel Air, the silence was louder than the screams of 10,000 fans. It was an accusatory silence, one that echoed in the vast, empty rooms and bounced off the gold records hanging on the walls like tombstones of a man who used to be. Insomnia was his constant companion, a ghost that sat at the edge of his bed and whispered questions for which he had no answers. Who was he? What was the point of all this? The applause? The money? It all felt like counterfeit currency, unable to purchase a single moment of genuine peace. He was the most famous man on the planet, and he had never felt more alone. Then, a flicker of light in the suffocating darkness. It came not from a stage light or a flashbulb, but from the pages of a book. It started with his hairdresser, Larry Geller, a man who spoke not of fame or fashion, but of consciousness, karma, and the search for the self. Geller was more than a stylist. He became a spiritual courier, smuggling contraband ideas past the intellectual blockade of the Memphis Mafia and into the hands of the king. He brought books, strange books with esoteric titles that promised a reality beyond the material world. This was the first rehook, the arrival of the guide who would show him a door out of his own life. Elvis, the boy who had grown up singing gospel in the Assembly of God Church in Tupelo, found a new kind of scripture. He devoured the words. Back in Memphis, late at night when Graceland was still and the world outside believed its king was sleeping, he was wide awake. He was underlining passages, making notes in the margins, his mind racing to connect the teachings of Eastern mystics with the Christian faith of his beloved mother, Gladys. He wasn't just reading, he was searching for an escape route. The change was subtle at first, a shift in the tectonic plates of his personality. He began speaking in parables, quoting from the texts he was reading. He'd try to engage his entourage, the loyal, rough-edged boys of the Memphis Mafia, in deep conversations about the nature of the soul. They would just stare back, their faces a mixture of confusion and concern. They were bodyguards, not philosophers. They were there for the party, for the lifestyle that Elvis's fame afforded them. This new, contemplative man was a stranger, and his quest for meaning felt like a threat to the comfortable reality they all inhabited. They saw a phase. They saw a dangerous hobby. They had no idea they were witnessing the opening salvos of a war for his very soul. The conversations with Geller grew more intense, more focused. The vague yearning for something more began to crystallize into a tangible plan. It was in the pages of Paramahansa Yogananda's Autobiography of a Yogi that Elvis found his destination. The book spoke of the Self-Realization Fellowship, a spiritual organization with centers in California, including a serene lakeside shrine and a hidden retreat in the desert. It wasn't a traditional Catholic monastery, but it had its own monastic order, a place where men and women could renounce the world and dedicate their lives entirely to the search for God. This was the second rehook. It was no longer a dream. It now had a name and an address. He became obsessed with the idea. He'd pepper Geller with questions for hours. What would it be like to trade the sequin jumpsuits for a simple robe? To shave his head? To erase the iconic image that had imprisoned him for a decade? To wake at dawn not to a film director's call, but to the sound of a meditation bell? The thought was terrifying, and it was the most beautiful, liberating idea he had ever had. It was the death of Elvis Presley, the brand, and the potential birth of Elvis Presley, the man. He decided he would do it. He would give it all up. Graceland, the cars, the career. He would walk away. The whispers began to travel, not from spies or traitors, but through the invisible network of commerce that surrounded the king. The change was manifesting in his work. On set, he started questioning the vapid dialogue, pushing back against the formulaic plots. His focus was elsewhere. Box office returns, while still massive, showed the slightest tremor, the first sign of audience fatigue. The money men in Hollywood noticed. And anything the money men noticed, the Colonel heard about. Colonel Tom Parker was not a man who dealt in matters of the soul. He was a carnival man, a maestro of the hustle. His God was the almighty dollar, and his holy scripture was the bottom line of a balance sheet. He managed his boy, Elvis, not as an artist, but as a prize steer, a blue ribbon attraction to be milked for every last cent. He had built an empire on the back of Elvis's talent, a meticulously constructed machine of movies, merchandise, and music. And now, a grain of sand called God was threatening to jam the gears. This was the third rehook. The antagonist enters the stage. The Colonel didn't need a spy in Elvis's house. He could read the financial reports. He could smell a threat to his 90% share of the profits from 1,000 miles away. He started making calls. He spoke to the studio heads. He spoke to the producers. He spoke to members of the Memphis Mafia, not asking directly, but planting seeds of doubt, applying pressure, reminding them who signed their paychecks. He was a master puppeteer, and he began to pull the strings. He didn't believe in God, but he certainly believed in the devil. And to him, anything that threatened the flow of money was the work of pure evil. These books, this Geller character, this talk of finding peace, it was a disease, a spiritual cancer that had to be cut out before it could metastasize and kill the golden goose. He gathered his ammunition, contracts, Nielsen ratings, box office reports, and guilt. He weaponized Elvis's own past, his deepest loyalties, his most profound love. Then he boarded a plane to Los Angeles. The confrontation didn't happen on a movie set or in a boardroom. It happened in the quiet sanctuary of the Bel Air mansion, the very place Elvis had begun to dream of his escape. Parker arrived not with a shout, but with the chilling calm of a surgeon preparing for an amputation. He sat Elvis down, the air thick with unspoken tension. The Memphis Mafia boys made themselves scarce, sensing the impending storm. Larry Geller had been barred from the property. It was just the showman and his star. This was the fourth rehook. The battle is joined. Parker laid out his case not with emotion, but with cold, hard facts. He spread papers across the coffee table, ledgers showing the millions of dollars at stake, contracts binding Elvis for years to come, commitments he had a legal obligation to fulfill. He spoke of the fans, the millions of people who had made Elvis who he was. "You want to abandon them, son?" he'd ask, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "You want to throw all this away for what? To go sit on a mountain and hum?" He framed the spiritual quest not as a search for enlightenment, but as an act of supreme selfishness. A betrayal, Elvis tried to explain, his voice filled with a desperate sincerity. He spoke of the emptiness, the feeling of being a hollowed-out version of himself. He talked about his soul, about a yearning that money couldn't satisfy. The Colonel just stared at him, his eyes like chips of ice, uncomprehending and unmoved. For Parker, a soul was not an asset. It couldn't be mortgaged, insured, or sold for a profit. It was a liability. Then, he played his final card, the ace of spades. "What would your mother think, Elvis?" The words hit Elvis with the force of a physical blow. Gladys, his beloved mother, the center of his universe, whose loss had left a wound in his heart that had never healed. The Colonel knew that Elvis's devotion to her memory was absolute, a sacred, untouchable thing, and he had just desecrated it, twisting it into a weapon to be used against him. He painted a picture of Gladys looking down from heaven, her heart breaking as she watched her son throw away the incredible life she had always dreamed for him, all for some strange foreign philosophy. It was a devastating, calculated act of psychological warfare. The Colonel stood up, his work done. He gathered his papers. A predator who had successfully cornered his prey. He didn't need to yell or threaten anymore. He had chained Elvis to the ghost of his mother. "You think on it, son," he said, his voice now deceptively soft. "You think about what you owe to her memory. You think about what you owe to the people who made you. You kill Elvis Presley, and you kill everything she was so proud of." He walked out of the room, leaving a silence that was heavier and more profound than any Elvis had ever known. The king was trapped. The plot to kill his persona had been discovered by the one man who had the power to stop it. He was caught between two irreconcilable worlds, the deafening roar of his public kingdom, and the silent call of his private soul. One promised him the world. The other promised him himself. The colonel had drawn the battle lines, forcing a choice that seemed impossible to make. Give up God, or betray his mother. The war had just begun, and its first casualty was Elvis's hope for a simple, peaceful escape. But was it ever really about escape? This is the fifth rehook. The true ghost is revealed. What if this entire desperate scramble for spiritual meaning, this flirtation with killing off his own identity, wasn't about finding God at all? What if it was about running from a ghost far older and far more terrifying than the memory of his mother? A ghost that had been with him since his very first breath. To understand the war raging inside Elvis, you have to go back to the very beginning, to January 8th, 1935. In that tiny two-room house built by his father, Gladys Presley gave birth to twins. The first, Jesse Garin, was stillborn. 35 minutes later, Elvis Aaron Presley entered the world, alive and screaming. He had survived. His brother had not. And in that moment, a debt was created in Elvis's soul that he would spend the rest of his life trying to repay. He grew up with the constant, unspoken presence of the brother he never knew. He was the one who got to live, to breathe, to sing. He carried not just his own dreams, but the phantom dreams of Jesse. This wasn't just a family tragedy. It was the core of his identity. He often spoke to his brother in private. He felt that when he was alone, Jesse was there. This wasn't a search for a new self. It was a desperate attempt to find out if he was even a whole self to begin with. The colonel's psychological attack, using the memory of Gladys, was brutal. But its true genius was that it unknowingly targeted this deeper, primordial wound. By chaining Elvis to his mother's memory, the colonel had also chained him to the guilt of being the surviving son, the one who was supposed to make good on both of their lives. The spiritual quest, in Elvis's mind, wasn't just for him. It was for Jesse too, a way to finally find peace for both of them. And the colonel had just called it a betrayal. The days that followed the colonel's visit were a study in silent surrender. Elvis didn't argue. He didn't fight back. He simply complied. One evening, in a chillingly quiet ceremony witnessed only by a few nervous members of the Memphis Mafia, he had the books gathered. All of them. The autobiography of a yogi, the impersonal life, the sacred texts that had been his lifeline. He took them out to the backyard incinerator. He didn't say a word. He just stood there as Jerry Schilling, his loyal but conflicted friend, tossed them into the flames one by one. The fire licked at the pages, curling the words about nirvana and cosmic consciousness into black ash. It was a funeral pyre for his own soul. With each book that vanished into the fire, a little more of the light in Elvis's eyes seemed to go with it. He was severing his connection to Geller, to his hopes, to his brief taste of freedom. He was killing Aaron to save Elvis. The colonel, ever the strategist, didn't leave the void empty for long. He knew that nature, and a superstar's psyche, abhors a vacuum. He began to systematically refill Elvis's life with the very things he had been trying to escape. The cage was rebuilt, but this time, the bars were gilded with pleasure and distraction. The Memphis Mafia were given new instructions. Keep him busy. Keep him entertained. Never leave him alone with his thoughts. The house that had briefly been a monastery was once again a playground. The silence he had craved was replaced by a constant, deafening noise. It was a brilliant, insidious strategy. The colonel wasn't just putting a stop to Elvis's spiritual journey. He was actively erasing it, burying the memory of it under an avalanche of materialism and meaningless fun. He was trying to overdose the patient on the very disease he was trying to cure. But you can't kill a ghost with noise. In the dead of night, when the parties were over and the sycophants had gone home, the silence would return. And so would Jesse. Elvis started talking to him more than ever. Not about God, not about enlightenment, but about the trap. They won't let us go, Jesse, he'd whisper to the empty space beside him in his cavernous bedroom. They've got us. It was in these moments that a new, dangerous idea began to form. The colonel had won the battle, but Elvis was determined not to lose the war. If he couldn't find his soul in the light, maybe he could find it in the dark. He had to play the game. He had to put the Elvis costume back on, smile for the cameras, sing the silly songs, but underneath, Aaron would be plotting. The rebellion went underground. His first move was re-establishing contact with Larry Geller. It was like a spy movie. Geller was blacklisted, forbidden from even calling the house. So Elvis used cutouts. He'd give a note to an old, trusted friend from Tupelo, someone outside the colonel's sphere of influence. They'd drive it to a payphone miles away and read it to Geller. The conversations were cryptic, coded. They spoke of the weather and reading material. Geller urged him not to give up. He told him the path was internal, that no one could take it away from him. He began sending books again, not to Graceland, but to secret P.O. boxes, delivered to trusted cousins who would smuggle them in. Elvis would read them late at night, under a single lamp, like a prisoner reading contraband after lockdown. He was living a double life in his own home. On the surface, the Colonel's plan was working perfectly. Elvis reported to the movie set for his next picture, Clambake. It was arguably one of his worst. A piece of cinematic fluff about a rich oil heir pretending to be a poor water skiing instructor. It was everything he now despised. Shallow, meaningless, and utterly fake. He went through the motions. A beautiful, hollow automaton. He sang the songs. He said the lines. He kissed the girl. He gave the Colonel and the studio exactly what they paid for. But something was different. The cast and crew noticed it. The old, easygoing charm was gone, replaced by a strange, detached intensity. In between takes, he wouldn't joke with the Memphis Mafia. He would sit by himself, staring off into the distance, his lips moving silently. He was having conversations, not with himself, but with Jesse. He was explaining the plan. They had to pretend. They had to make them all believe they had won, that the old Elvis was back. But secretly, they were gathering strength, learning, waiting for the right moment to make a break for it. This psychological split began to manifest in terrifying ways. One day on set, they were filming a simple scene where Elvis had to react to a line from his co-star, Shelley Fabares. The line was something forgettable, like, "What are you thinking about?" She delivered the line perfectly, but Elvis didn't respond. He just stared at her, or rather, through her. His eyes were unfocused. A long, awkward silence fell over the set. The director, a nervous man named Arthur Nadel, cleared his throat. "Elvis? The line is, 'I was just thinking about you.'" Elvis didn't seem to hear him. He continued to stare into the middle distance. Then, very softly, he said, "He doesn't believe you." The cast and crew exchanged confused glances. Shelley Fabares, trying to save the scene, improvised. "Who doesn't believe me, Scott?" she asked, using his character's name. Elvis's head snapped back to look at her, and his eyes were blazing with a fire no one had ever seen before. It wasn't the playful fire of his early performances. It was something dark and furious. "Don't you talk to him," he snarled, his voice a low growl. "You don't get to talk to him." The set went dead quiet. People froze. This wasn't in the script. This wasn't Elvis Presley. This was a man on the edge of a precipice, arguing with an invisible person in the middle of a multi-million-dollar film production. Joe Esposito, one of the Colonel's most loyal men, immediately stepped in. Cut! Let's take 5, everybody. Elvis needs a break." They rushed him to his trailer, the whole production grinding to a halt. The official story put out by the studio was that he was feeling unwell, a touch of the flu. But inside that trailer, a storm was breaking. Elvis was pacing back and forth, agitated, talking to the air. "They're trying to separate us," he said. "They're trying to keep you quiet." It was the first major crack in the facade. The perfect soldier was breaking down. He had been holding 2 realities in his mind for so long, the Colonel's world and his own secret world, that the membrane between them was beginning to tear. The incident sent a shockwave all the way back to the Colonel's office. He got the call and listened intently, his face unreadable. He had contained the spiritual rebellion, but he had unleashed something else. Something he didn't understand. A psychosis. He had wanted to control Elvis Presley, the asset, but he had forgotten that inside the asset was a man. A man. And maybe, just maybe, the ghost of his brother. The Colonel had seen this as a simple business problem, an employee with a bad idea. But now, it was becoming a psychological horror story, and the monster he was trying to cage was the one thing he could never buy, control, or intimidate. The part of Elvis that didn't belong to Elvis at all. The battle for Elvis's soul had entered a new, far more dangerous phase. It was no longer about enlightenment versus entertainment. It was about sanity versus madness. The Colonel, however, saw it differently. To him, madness wasn't a liability. It was just another variable to be controlled. The incident on the Clambake set wasn't a disaster. It was a data point. It showed him the limits of his psychological pressure, and it told him he needed a new kind of tool. But what if this breakdown wasn't just an accident? What if the madness was being encouraged? What if the Colonel, in his twisted genius, found a way to weaponize Elvis's own mind against him? He made another phone call, not to a studio head, but to a discreet physician from Las Vegas, a man known for handling special clients with unique needs. This was Dr. George C. Nikopoulos, a man who would become known simply as Dr. Nick. The colonel presented the problem. Elvis was becoming unreliable and distracted by dangerous ideas. The prescription? A carefully managed regimen of pharmaceuticals. They weren't just tranquilizers to calm him down. They were chemical walls. Uppers to get him on set, downers to get him to sleep, and a cocktail of other drugs to fog the mind, to dull the spiritual searching, and to keep the voice of Jesse buried under a chemical haze. Elvis, exhausted and confused, accepted the help. He thought the doctor was there to cure him, but the drugs had a paradoxical effect. Instead of silencing Jesse, they gave him a terrifying new clarity within the fog. The chemical prison didn't just contain Elvis. It gave his invisible brother a concrete enemy to fight. The battle was no longer just in his soul. It was now in his very bloodstream. The years that followed became a long, chemical twilight. The colonel's strategy was brutally effective. The movies blurred into one another. Each one a little worse than the last, each script a little more meaningless. Elvis was present, but not accounted for. He was a ghost in his own life, haunted by a brother whose voice was now twisted by the very drugs meant to silence him. In the dead of night, in the gilded cage of Graceland, the whispers would come. But Jesse's voice was no longer a comfort. It was a distorted echo of his own self-loathing. "They're turning you into a joke, Elvis," it would hiss in the dark. A singing puppet. The chemical walls didn't keep Jesse out. They trapped Elvis inside with him, in a prison of paranoia and regret. Sanity was a negotiation, held moment to moment. The breaking point came not in a flash of anger, but in a moment of profound silence. It was 1968. The movies had dried up. His music was off the charts. He was seen as a relic. The colonel had arranged a television special, a safe, family-friendly Christmas show, to sell a few more records. Another performance for the asset. But as Elvis looked in the mirror, the fog momentarily lifted. He didn't see a king. He saw a prisoner staring back. And in that reflection, he heard Jesse's voice, not as a tormentor, but as it was in the beginning. A simple, honest question. Is this all you are? Is this what you're leaving behind? The drugs, the colonel, the money, it all fell away. In that moment, he wasn't just Elvis Presley. He was Elvis Aaron and Jesse Garon, two halves of one soul, finally in agreement. He had to fight back. His rebellion wasn't a tantrum. It was a quiet, unshakable declaration of independence. He threw out the script. He demanded a live audience. He put on the black leather. The colonel was furious, seeing millions in potential earnings evaporate. But for the first time in a decade, Elvis was not listening to the colonel. He was listening to the music inside him. He was listening to his brother. What followed wasn't a performance. It was a resurrection. Raw, primal, and electric. He wasn't playing a character. He was himself. Every note of Heartbreak Hotel, every snarl of Jailhouse Rock was a lifetime of frustration and passion breaking free. He wasn't just singing songs. He was reclaiming his own story, one line at a time. The chemical walls came crumbling down under the sheer force of his own truth. For one brilliant, beautiful night, he was free. He had won. He had integrated the two halves of his soul, using the memory of his brother not as a wound, but as a source of strength. He proved that the man was more powerful than the asset. But the world doesn't always allow for such victories to last. The colonel was a patient man. The system Elvis had rebelled against simply waited for him to come off stage. The prison was rebuilt around him, this time with sequins and spotlights. The drugs returned. The isolation deepened. He had won the battle for his soul. But the war for his life was a different story. Yet that moment of pure, unchained artistry can never be taken away. It stands as a testament to the man behind the myth, the spirit that refused to be completely silenced, the voice of a boy who just wanted to sing. The story of Elvis is not just a story of fame, but of a man's fight for his own soul against impossible odds, a fight he never, ever gave up. To explore more hidden chapters from the life of the king, and to ensure his story is never forgotten, subscribe to forever_Elvis_Stories. Click the button now and become part of